was on the porch when she opened the door. A chair, small and perfectly made, built from wood the color of dark honey, with a cushion in a deep green fabric that she had never seen in any of the Caldwell Ridge merchants, and that fit the seat so precisely it could only have been made for it. She stood in the doorway in the October morning and looked at it, and felt the specific disorientation of someone who has spent 10 months making herself as small and as unremarkable as possible, and has just been handed evidence that someone has been watching with the specific quality of attention that smallness is not designed to survive. There was no note. There was no indication of origin. There was only the chair sitting on the porch in the pale Wyoming morning light, as if it had always been there, and had simply been waiting for her to open the door and find it. She carried it inside. She set it by the window where she had been putting a cushion on the floor for 10 months. She sat in it. It fit her perfectly. The height and the angle and the specific dimensions of it. The way the back supported her exactly where her back needed supporting after a long day of sewing work. The way the arms were precisely the right height for someone of her particular slightness. It had been built for her, specifically, completely, by someone who had been paying the kind of attention she had spent 10 months trying to make unnecessary. It took her 3 weeks to find out who. And when she found out, it changed everything. Welcome to Cowboy Ironheart. If this story already has you, leave a comment and let us know you're here. There is a particular kind of invisibility that a woman can construct around herself when the world has given her sufficient reason to believe that being seen is not safe. It is not the invisibility of someone who is naturally quiet or naturally retiring or naturally inclined toward the background of things. It is the deliberate, practiced, carefully maintained invisibility of someone who has learned, through specific and sufficient instruction, that her visible presence produces consequences she does not want, and that the most reliable way to avoid those consequences is to reduce the visible presence to the smallest possible form. Clara Ashwood had been building that invisibility since long before she came to Caldwell Ridge, and she had refined it across the 10 months of her residency in the Wyoming town into something so complete and so practiced that most of the town's residents, if asked to describe the seamstress who lived above the shop on the main street, would have struggled to produce more than a general outline. Dark hair, quiet, does good work, keeps to herself. She had grown up in a small Missouri town called Harker's Ford, the only child of a mother who had been widowed young and who had raised Clara with the specific combination of genuine love and practical hardness that frontier widowhood produced in women who understood that sentiment was a luxury and competence was a necessity. Her mother had been a seamstress, as her mother's mother had been before her, and Clara had learned the work, the way she had learned everything in her childhood, by watching closely and then doing it until she could do it well, which had not taken long because she had her mother's hands and her mother's eye and the specific quality of attention that fine needlework required and that she had in abundance from an early age. She had been happy in Harker's Ford, in the specific, uncomplicated way of children who are loved and useful and have not yet encountered the particular difficulties that the world reserves for later. She had been good at school, good at the sewing work, good at the domestic management that her mother's long working hours required her to contribute to, and she had been, in those early years, a girl who existed in her full dimensions without having learned yet to reduce them. She had met Edmund Ashwood when she was 22. He was 30, a land agent with an office in the county seat, a man of considerable surface charm and the specific confidence of someone who had always found the world accommodating and who carried that accommodation as a natural expectation rather than as a recognized privilege. He had come to Harker's Ford on a land transaction, had encountered Clara at a social occasion, and had pursued her with the focused attention of someone who had decided he wanted something and was accustomed to obtaining what he decided he wanted. She had found him at 22 and accustomed to the modest attentions of a small Missouri town, genuinely disorienting in the specific way of someone who is being given more focused attention than they have previously received, and who mistakes the intensity of the attention for the quality of the person giving it. They had married within the year. She had gone to the county seat as his wife with the specific hope of a young woman who has been told she is loved and who has no particular reason yet to examine what the telling costs. Edmund's household was comfortable and his business was successful and his social standing in the county seat was everything he had represented it as being. And for the first months Clara had found in the novelty of the new life and the genuine pleasure of the sewing work she continued in the new town sufficient material for the happiness she had anticipated. The erosion had begun slowly. Edmund had opinions about how his wife should present herself, which was not unusual for men of his time and place, but his opinions were more specific and more consequential than most, applied not just to her clothing and her conduct in social settings, but to her manner of speaking and her friendships, and the way she spent the hours that were nominally her own. He had opinions about which topics were appropriate for her to have opinions about. And when she had offered opinions on topics outside that narrow approved range, he had responded with a quality of patient correction that communicated, very clearly and without ever raising his voice, that the opinion had been an error in judgment on her part, rather than a contribution to a conversation. She had learned to narrow her opinions, then her friendships, then her manner of speaking, then gradually and without any single moment that she could point to as the turning, the full dimensions of herself that she had been before Edmund Ashwood had decided he wanted her. She had been becoming smaller for 3 years when the illness came. A chest condition that arrived in the winter of their 3rd year, and that Edmund managed the way he managed everything, with the practical efficiency of someone for whom other people's difficulties were primarily organizational problems to be resolved. He recovered. The recovery was slow and incomplete, and across the months of it, Clara had cared for him with the focused competence she brought to all practical demands, and had felt, in the long nights of the illness and the long days of the recovery, the specific weight of a life that had become entirely about the management of someone else's needs, and that had no remaining room for anything that was entirely hers. Edmund had died in the 4th year, not from the chest condition which had resolved after a fashion, but from a separate and sudden event that the doctor had called a failure of the heart, and that had taken him in an afternoon without warning. Clara had sat in the parlor of the county seat house in the evening after, and had felt the complicated mixture of things she had been afraid she would feel, which she had felt, and which she had never spoken of to anyone, because the speaking of it would have required a listener she did not have, and a trust she had not been able to build in 4 years of marriage to a man who had not been interested in building it with her. The county seat had opinions about Edmund Ashwood's widow. The county seat had been fond of Edmund, who had been charming and successful, and had represented the community in the specific ways that communities like to be represented. And its opinion of the widow was shaped by its opinion of the man, and by what it needed the story of his life and death to mean. Clara had grieved. She had grieved genuinely, and in the private way that had become her only available way of doing anything interior. And she had managed the estate and the house and the social obligations of widowhood with the competence that was by now entirely automatic. And she had done all of it while carrying the complicated truth that the grief was for the life she had hoped for, rather than for the life she had lived, which was a distinction the county seat would not have understood and which she had not attempted to explain. The trouble had begun with the estate. Edmund's finances, which he had always managed with the air of someone whose financial standing was beyond question, had proven, in the months after his death, to be in a condition that was considerably less secure than his air of management had suggested. There had been debts. The resolution of those debts had required the sale of assets that Clara had not known were mortgaged, and the process of that resolution had been conducted in public, in the specific way that financial difficulties in small communities were conducted in public, which meant that the community had been present for the full accounting and had drawn from the available information the conclusions that available information without context tended to produce. The conclusions had not been kind. They had not been entirely without foundation. There was enough truth in the visible facts to construct a story from, even if the story required omitting the parts that would have complicated the telling, and they had moved through the county seat with the specific efficiency of things that told people what they were already inclined to believe about a widow who had not performed her grief with sufficient visibility and who now appeared to be the beneficiary of a financial situation that was more complicated than it had been presented. She had stayed for 8 months. She had stayed longer than was comfortable and shorter than was dignified, and had left on a Tuesday morning in the early spring, when the weight of staying had finally exceeded the pride that had been keeping her there, taking with her what was genuinely hers and leaving what was not, and climbing onto the stage with the specific quality of someone who is not running, but is also not pretending that staying is still possible. She had come to Caldwell Ridge, Wyoming, because a notice in a regional circular had advertised for a seamstress with experience in fine work, and she had fine work experience, and Wyoming was far enough from Missouri that no one would know the version of her that the county seat had decided she was. She had arrived in March of 1883 with her sewing equipment and a modest trunk, and the specific determination of someone who intends to rebuild something on cleared ground and is not yet certain what the something will be, but is certain that the clearing was necessary. The town had received her with the practical indifference of a community that needed a seamstress, and was not particularly invested in the circumstances that had produced one. She had her rooms above the shop, modest and functional, with the one window she had made into her reading place, the window that caught the last of the afternoon light, and that she had been putting a cushion on the floor to sit in front of for 10 months, because she had not yet allowed herself to do anything for her own comfort that was not strictly necessary and that could not be justified by the work. She sewed. She was very good at it, and the town recognized quickly that she was very good at it, and she had more work than she could comfortably manage by the summer, and she managed it with the focused, competent grace that had become her primary available register. accepting the work and completing it well, and returning each evening to the small rooms and the window cushion and the books that were the one private pleasure she had maintained across all the years of reducing herself, the one space where she had never entirely disappeared. She had been in Caldwell Ridge for 10 months when she opened her door on an October morning and found a chair on the porch, small and precisely made and built from a wood, the color of dark honey that she did not recognize, and with a cushion in a deep green fabric that she had never seen in any of the town's merchants. She had looked at it for a long time before she picked it up. She had looked at it with the specific quality of someone encountering something they do not have a category for, something that does not fit into any of the existing frameworks of their experience, and that therefore requires a new framework that they do not yet have. Someone had made this. Someone had made it for her, specifically. Someone had been paying the kind of attention to her that produced this chair. The specific, comprehensive attention that noticed the window and the cushion on the floor and the exact dimensions of a slim woman who sat in a particular way at a particular angle for hours at a time, with a book in her hands in the last of the afternoon light. She had not known that anyone in Caldwell Ridge had been paying that kind of attention to her. She had been working with considerable effort to ensure that no one was. She carried the chair inside. She set it by the window. She sat in it. And she felt, for the first time and longer than she could accurately account for, the specific disorienting warmth of being known by someone who had said nothing about the knowing and had built the evidence of it instead. There are men who build things the way other men talk, compulsively, constantly, as if the building is the primary available language and everything else is translation. Jasper Holt was that kind of man. Though Caldwell Ridge had spent 4 years understanding only the functional dimension of this, and not the deeper one, which was that what he built and how he built it and for whom he chose to build it were not merely professional decisions but personal ones. The specific vocabulary of a man who had never been entirely comfortable with words and had found, in the grain of wood and the weight of a well-made joint and the specific satisfaction of a thing that fit together perfectly, a form of expression that was more accurate than anything language had ever offered him. He had been born in the eastern part of Wyoming, in a valley that had been settled by his father's family 2 generations back, and that had the specific relationship with the landscape that came from people who had learned it from the inside over time, rather than arriving and imposing their expectations on it. His father had been a rancher, practical and reliable, and not particularly given to reflection, who had communicated his values through the quality of what he did rather than the quality of what he said. His mother had been a woman of considerable warmth and specific intelligence, who had understood her son's particular quality from early on and had given it the specific gift of her recognition, which was the most valuable thing she had to give and which she had given without reservation. He had been large from adolescence, the kind of large that announced itself before the boy had learned to manage what the announcement communicated, and he had spent his teenage years developing the interior discipline of someone who understands that their exterior produces impressions that precede them into every room. He had learned to be still, not passive, not empty, but genuinely still in the way of things that have settled into their own weight and no longer need to adjust themselves for the benefit of the space around them. He had learned to build things instead of talking about them, to let the made objects speak for the interior condition that had produced it, which was a method of communication that most people did not know how to receive, and that he had accepted as simply the condition of being himself in the world. He had come to Caldwell Ridge 4 years ago when the town's rapid growth had produced more building work than the existing carpenter could manage alone. And he had stayed because the work was good and the country was good, and because staying had seemed at the end of the first year more worth the doing than continuing to move. He had built half the buildings on the main street. He had built the schoolhouse and the church, and the expansion of the mercantile and the new stable at the north end of town, and a considerable number of the houses in the residential streets that had grown up around the commercial center as Caldwell Ridge had committed to being permanent. He was good at his work in the way that went past professional competence into something that the people who had used his work over time had come to understand was a different quality entirely, the quality of someone who cared about whether things lasted. He had noticed Clara Ashwood in her first week in Caldwell Ridge, with the comprehensive automatic quality that he noticed everything, which was without decision and without agenda, simply the function of a man for whom observation was the primary available mode of understanding the world around him. He had seen her arrive on the march stage, small and dark-haired and carrying herself with the specific quality of someone who has learned to make themselves unremarkable, the specific practiced invisibility of someone who has had reasons to practice it. He had noticed the trunk, which was modest. He had noticed the quality of her coat, which was good but worn in the way of something that had been maintained with care past the point at which a replacement would have been appropriate, which told him something about resources and about the specific pride of someone who refused to let difficulties show. He had noticed the way she had looked at the shop and the rooms above it, with an expression that was not the excitement of someone beginning something new, but the quiet determination of someone who has arrived at a place they intend to make work regardless of what it costs them. He had filed all of it. He was good at filing things, at holding observations in the interior place where he held most things, and letting them accumulate into understanding over time, rather than rushing to conclusions from insufficient evidence. He had watched her across the spring and summer with the patient attentiveness he brought to things he was trying to understand. And what he had been trying to understand was the specific quality of her invisibility, which was not natural but constructed, the specific achievement of someone who had worked at being unremarkable and had become very good at it. He noticed the work she did, which was exceptional, and the way she carried herself while doing it, which was the way of someone performing competence for an audience they did not entirely trust. He noticed the evenings through the window above the shop, the lamp burning at the specific window where the afternoon light came in, the shape of her in the chairless space with her books, sitting on what he could see from the street, was a cushion on the floor night after night through the spring and into the summer and through the fall. He noticed the cushion on the floor with the specific quality of a man who builds things looking at a problem that has a solution. And he held the noticing in the interior place for some time before he decided what to do with it. He had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times in 10 months. The brief exchanges of a small town where everyone's paths crossed without necessarily connecting, a nod on the main street, a brief acknowledgement when he had done repair work on the shop building and she had come downstairs to ask about the duration of the noise. The specific, minimal social contact of two people who occupied the same small community and had not found, in the ordinary course of things, a reason for more. He knew enough from those 12 exchanges to know several things about her that she had not intended him to know, because she had not understood that he was paying the kind of attention that 12 minimal exchanges could yield to a man who listened the way he listened. He knew that she was from Missouri originally, which she had mentioned once in passing, in a way that suggested she did not want it pursued. He knew that she had been married, which the whole town knew from the widow designation that had preceded her arrival. He knew that her voice when she spoke had a quality of careful consideration that suggested she had learned to measure her words before offering them, which told him something about the conditions under which she had learned to speak. He knew that her hands, which he had seen briefly on the occasion of the building repair, were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly and who took better care of the work than of the hands themselves, which told him something about her relationship with self-care. And he knew from the window and the cushion on the floor and the lamp burning at the same hour every evening that she read every night and that the reading was not a pastime but a necessity. The specific daily necessity of a person for whom the interior world of books was the most reliably safe space available. He had built the chair over the course of a week in September, in the evenings after the day's work was done, working by lamplight in the back of his workshop with the door closed, not because he was hiding the work, but because the work was private in the way that most of what he made was private, a thing between himself and the wood and the specific intention of the making. He had measured carefully, not Clara herself, which would have required an approach he had not made, but the window he had observed from the street, the angle of the light in the evening hours, the height of the sill, the specific dimensions of a woman who was slight and fine-boned in the way he had catalogued across 10 months of observation. He had built the chair to those measurements with the specific precision of someone for whom inexactness was not an acceptable outcome. And he had made it from a cherry wood he had been saving since the previous winter for a project worthy of the grain, and he had upholstered the cushion himself in a green fabric he had ordered from a supplier in Denver, specifically for this purpose, because nothing available in Caldwell Ridge had the right quality. He had placed it on the porch in the early morning of the first day of October before the town was properly awake. He had not left a note, because a note would have required him to explain the chair in language, and the chair explained itself in the language he used, which was the language of made things, and he had trusted that whoever was supposed to understand it would understand it when they were ready to, and not before. He had gone back to his workshop and he had worked through the day with the specific quality of someone who has done a thing they needed to do and has no remaining uncertainty about whether the doing was right. And he had not gone past the seamstress shop on the main street that day or the next or the day after, giving her the privacy of the receiving before anything else was required. It was 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, that he looked up from the beam he was setting on the new building at the end of the main street and found her standing 20 feet away, looking at him with the hazel eyes that had been doing careful work in his direction for some time, and he understood that she had found him and had come to ask what she needed to ask. He set down the beam. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She said, "The chair on my porch in October." It was not a question. She had already answered the question. She was confirming the answer. He said, "Yes." She said, "You built it." He said, "Yes." She said, "How did you know about the window?" He said, "I have been working on this street for 4 years." He said it without the particular quality of someone who expected the observation to require justification, simply as a fact. He said, "The lamp is at the same window every evening." He said, "You were sitting on the floor?" She was very still. She looked at him with the hazel eyes that he had been watching from a distance for 10 months and that were, at close range, considerably more than distance had allowed him to see the intelligence in them, the wariness, and beneath both of those, something that was being disturbed by this conversation in the specific way of something that has been very still for a long time and has just been touched. She said, "You could have told me?" "You could have asked." He said, "You would have said it was not necessary." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes. I would have." He said, "I know." She looked at him for a long moment in the October morning light, the Wyoming light that showed everything, and he stood in it with a complete unhurried steadiness. That was simply how he stood in all light. And neither of them said anything for a moment that had more inside it than the words that had just been exchanged. Then she said, "It fits perfectly." He said, "I know." He said it without pride and without false modesty, as the plain statement of someone who had made something to specific measurements and had made it correctly. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You are welcome." She turned and walked back toward the shop, and he watched her go with the specific quality of attention he had been giving her for 10 months. And then he picked up the beam and returned to his work. And the October morning continued around both of them with the unhurried indifference of a Wyoming day that did not know or care that something had just shifted in the specific small geography of two people who had been in the same town for 10 months and had just, in 4 minutes of direct exchange, covered more ground than the previous 10 months had managed. The conversation on the October morning had lasted 4 minutes and had covered more interior ground than either of them had covered with another person in the previous year, which was itself a kind of information about both of them and about the specific quality of what had just happened, though neither of them was ready to examine that information directly in the immediate aftermath of the exchange. Clara had walked back to the shop with the specific quality of someone who has just said more than they planned to say, and has not yet determined what the saying means or what comes next, and she had sat down at the sewing table and picked up the current work with the focused efficiency that was her reliable refuge in moments of interior disruption. And she had sewn for 2 hours without lifting her eyes from the work, except to thread needles, which was itself an indication of the disruption since she normally looked up frequently to rest her eyes on the middle distance or the window. Jasper had returned to the beam and finished the morning's work with the same unhurried competence he brought to all his work, and he had eaten his midday meal at the bench outside the workshop and had spent the afternoon on the interior framing of the new building, and he had gone home at the end of the day to the small house at the edge of town that he had built himself in his first year in Caldwell Ridge, and that he had continued to improve in the years since, and he had sat on the porch in the October evening with his coffee, and he had thought with the patient, unhurried quality he brought to most things he thought about the way she had looked at him when she said "it fits perfectly," and about the specific expression that had moved through her face in the moment before she said it, which was the expression of someone receiving something they had not known they needed until the receiving showed them the shape of the needing. The forced proximity arrived, as it tended to arrive, through the ordinary practical architecture of a small frontier town that did not have unlimited professional resources, and that occasionally required its residents to need things from each other that they might have preferred, in the interest of a comfortable distance, not to need. It arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the conversation on the street, in the form of a split in the structural beam above the doorway of the seamstress shop that Jasper identified when he was passing, and that, upon closer inspection, was sufficiently serious to require immediate attention before the Wyoming weather made it worse. He had stood outside the shop looking at the split for a moment, and then he had gone inside. She had been at the sewing table when the door opened, which was where she usually was at 9 in the morning, and she had looked up with the specific quality of someone who was not expecting a visitor and whose expression showed the brief, unguarded moment of adjustment before the composure came back into place. He was very large in the shop doorway, which had been sized for ordinary men, and he had to angle himself through it in the way she had seen him angle through other doorways on the main street. the automatic accommodation of a man who had been navigating spaces built for smaller people for his entire adult life. He said, "There is a split in the beam above your doorway." He said it without preamble, without the social construction of a visit, as the simple statement of a practical fact that required her awareness. He said it needs to be addressed before the weather turns. He said, "I can do it today if you're willing to have the disruption." She had looked at him for a moment. The composure was in place, but there was something in the quality of it, some slight imprecision in its edges. That told him the conversation from Tuesday had not settled entirely. She said, "How long will it take?" He said, "Most of the morning." She said, "I can work around it." He said, "You may need to work in the back room. The repair requires removing the door temporarily." She said, "That is acceptable." He said, "I will start now if that is suitable." She said, "It is." He went to get his tools. He worked on the beam through the morning with the focused competence of someone who had been doing this kind of work for most of his life and who had no remaining questions about the correct approach, moving through the stages of the repair with the unhurried efficiency that came from genuine mastery rather than practiced speed. The shop was small enough that his presence filled it in a way that he was aware of and that he managed with the specific care of a large man who had learned that his physical presence in enclosed spaces required deliberate attention to avoid being overwhelming. He kept to the work. He did not make conversation. He was aware of her in the back room, the sound of the sewing machine running steadily, the particular rhythm of her work that he had come to recognize from passing the shop on the main street, where the sound reached the street on the quiet mornings. She came out at mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee, which she set on the workbench he had brought in without comment, and returned to the back room, which he understood as the practical hospitality of someone who was offering what was appropriate without requiring an exchange around the offering. He drank the coffee when he reached a natural pause in the work. It was good coffee, strong and without excess, the coffee of someone who knew what they wanted and made it that way. At some point the rain began. Not the hesitant October rain that arrived and reconsidered and arrived again, but the committed rain of a Wyoming autumn that had decided on something and intended to follow through. He heard it change quality on the roof and on the street outside, and he assessed the remaining work, and understood that the door would need to stay removed longer than he had planned, because the wood needed to be properly dry before the final fit, and the rain had complicated that timeline. He went to the backroom doorway and said, "The rain has changed the schedule. The door will need to stay off until tomorrow morning at the earliest." She looked up from the sewing. She said, "My customers come through that door." He said, "I know." He said, "I can rig a weather cover that will keep the rain out while allowing access. It will not be fully functional, but it will serve for today." She said, "Can you do that with what you have?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then please do." He rigged the weather cover with the efficient improvisation of someone who had solved similar problems in similar conditions many times, and it was adequate, and she nodded when she assessed it and went back to her work. They spent the rest of the morning in the specific proximity of 2 people who are in the same small space doing different work, and who are both aware of the other in a way that neither is fully prepared to address directly. He worked on the beam preparation. She worked at the sewing table, having moved back to the main room once the rain required the weather cover and the immediate construction noise had reduced. The machine ran and stopped and ran again with the specific rhythm of careful finish work. He planned a section of the replacement wood with the long, smooth strokes of someone who understood the grain and was working with it rather than against it. And the sound of the plane was the specific sound of good carpentry, steady and honest. She said, "At some point in the late morning," without looking up from the work, "What kind of wood is the chair made from?" He paused in his planing. He said, "Cherry." She said, "I did not recognize it." He said, "It is not common here." He said, "I had been saving it." She looked up at that. She said, "Saving it for what?" He said, "For something worth the grain." She looked at him for a moment with the hazel eyes. He said nothing further and returned to the planing. She returned to the sewing, but the something worth the grain sat between them in the small space of the shop, with the rain on the roof and the weather cover over the doorway, and the specific quality of 2 people who have said something true to each other and are both in the process of determining what to do with the truth. At midday, she brought sandwiches from the kitchen behind the back room without announcement, set them on the workbench beside the empty coffee cups, and sat at the sewing table with her own. He washed his hands at the basin she had indicated earlier and ate standing at the workbench, which she had not told him to do, but which seemed the natural spatial arrangement for two people who had not yet established what kind of proximity was comfortable between them. They ate in the specific silence of people who have been in each other's company long enough for the silence to have lost its social awkwardness without yet having established the warmth that comes after the awkwardness. She said, "You have been in Caldwell Ridge 4 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "You built most of the main street." He said, "A fair portion of it." She said, "The schoolhouse." He said, "Yes." She said, "My customers tell me the joinery in the schoolhouse is exceptional." He looked at her. She said, "I am not making conversation. I'm observing that people who work with their hands recognize the quality of work done by other people who work with their hands," he said. "That is accurate." She said, "I have looked at the chair carefully." She said, "The joinery is exceptional there too." He said, "Thank you." She said, "I am not paying a compliment. I am stating an observation." He said, "I understood that." And something in the way he said it, the complete absence of any requirement that she had meant it differently, produced in her the specific expression he had seen twice now and was beginning to understand, was the expression she wore when something surprised her by being exactly what it appeared to be, rather than something more complicated underneath. The afternoon continued in the same specific proximity, the rain maintaining its commitment outside, the work on both sides continuing with its own requirements, and the space between them gradually acquiring the specific quality of a space that two people have been in together long enough for it to have assumed a shape that is particular to their combined presence, rather than to either of them alone. He finished the beam preparation by mid-afternoon and began the careful work of fitting the replacement piece, which required both hands and his full attention and produced the specific focused silence of fine carpentry, the silence of someone whose entire consciousness is organized around a single precise task. She hemmed an evening dress for the mayor's wife with the specific focused silence of fine sewing, the silence of someone whose fingers knew what they were doing well enough that the mind could remain partly elsewhere. And where the mind remained partly was in the vicinity of the conversation about the cherry wood and what it had been saved for. At one point in the late afternoon, he asked her to hold a section of the framework in place while he worked the joint. A practical request that required her to stand close enough to the work that she was within the general radius of his attention, which was a different thing from being within the general radius of most people's attention. She held the section as he asked, her small hands steady on the wood, and he worked the joint with the careful precision of the work, and she was aware of his hands near hers without their touching, the enormous scarred hands that had made the chair that fit her perfectly, moving through the work with a gentleness that was. She was finding the consistent quality of how he handled things he cared about doing well. He said, "You can release it now." She released it. He tested the joint. It held. He said, "Good." She stepped back to the appropriate social distance, and he tested the joint again, and it was good. Was better than good. Was the specific quality of a thing made correctly by someone who had no tolerance for less than correct. She went back to the sewing table. He continued with the fitting. The rain continued on the roof. The afternoon light, what there was of it through the rain, moved across the shop in the slow way of October light that was already preparing to be shorter and lower than before. And the small shop on the main street of Caldwell Ridge held two people in its particular atmosphere of tools and thread and rain and the smell of cherry wood being worked, and the specific quality of a silence that was no longer entirely the silence of strangers. November arrived in Caldwell Ridge with the specific authority of a Wyoming autumn that has finished being tentative and is committed to what it is going to be. The warmth of October drained out of the days with the particular efficiency of mountain weather that does not negotiate, leaving mornings that were serious and afternoons that were merely cold and evenings that made the lamplit interiors of the town's buildings feel less like shelter and more like the necessary condition of survival. The leaves were gone from everything except the stubborn few that held on past all reasonable expectation, and the pine ridges above the valley were their permanent dark green against a sky that had settled into the specific gray-blue of Wyoming winter beginning to consider itself. And the light had the quality it acquired in November, low and honest and without the warmth that would have made it flattering, a light that showed things as they were rather than as they might appear to be under more generous conditions. Clara worked through the change of season with the focused practicality that had been her primary available mode since arriving in Caldwell Ridge, and the working was the same as it had always been in its external form. The sewing table and the good light and the careful fine work that had given her a reputation in the town for quality that was reflected in the steady supply of commissions that kept her adequately occupied and adequately solvent. But the working had changed in a specific quality that she was in the process of understanding, the quality of the interior state of the person doing it, which was different from what it had been in October and September and the months before those. She was not entirely certain when the change had begun, but she was certain that it had begun, and she had the specific honesty with herself that comes from spending a great deal of time alone with your own thoughts, to understand that the beginning had something to do with a small cherry wood chair and the October morning when she had stood on the main street and confirmed what she had already understood. Jasper had finished the beam repair on the Friday morning, fitting the door back into place with the precise fit of work done correctly, and he had tested it 3 times before telling her it was done, which was the kind of thoroughness she recognized as the quality of someone who held their work to a standard that was internal rather than external, who would have tested it 3 times regardless of whether anyone was watching. She had paid him what he asked, which was less than the work warranted, and she had said so directly, and he had said the price was what the price was, and she had understood that arguing was not going to be productive, and had accepted the invoice and thanked him, and he had gathered his tools and gone. He had been back on the Monday, not for a repair, not for any work-related reason she could immediately identify, but with a small piece of equipment that he set on her step, a door wedge, precisely made, that prevented the door from swinging too far in the wind, which she had mentioned in passing on the Thursday that it had a tendency to do, and that banged against the wall in a way that disturbed the fine work. She had not asked him to address this. She had mentioned it the way you mention things when you were making conversation with someone who worked in wood, the way you noted a detail without expectation of response. He had heard it, filed it, and addressed it the way he addressed everything he noticed, quietly, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement. She had found the wedge on Monday morning and had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it before picking it up and testing it in the door, which had fit perfectly and which thereafter did not bang against the wall. She had thought about going to thank him and had decided that thanking him for every small thing he did would create an economy of exchange that was not the right register for what was actually happening, which was something quieter and more particular than an economy of exchange. She had used the wedge and not said anything about it, and she had trusted, with the specific trust of someone who was beginning to understand how this particular man communicated, that the using of it was itself the acknowledgement and that it was sufficient. The small things continued through November. They were not frequent, and they were not dramatic, and they were not the kind of thing that she could have pointed to as a pattern if someone had asked her to describe what was happening between herself and the carpenter who worked on the main street of Caldwell Ridge. But they accumulated, in the way that small true things accumulated when they were consistent and when they were specifically directed, into something that had a weight she was beginning to notice. A length of oilcloth appeared on her step one morning after a heavy rain, exactly the right size to cover the work table she had been protecting with a collection of inadequate rags on the day she moved work to the porch. A small brass hook appeared beside the doorframe, at the exact height where she had been hanging her coat on the edge of the door in the mornings when the inside hooks were occupied, a hook that was precisely at the height where her arm fell naturally when she reached to hang something without looking. These were not grand gestures. They were not the kind of thing that announced themselves as romantic or significant or anything other than practical. They were the specific practical vocabulary of a man who had been paying comprehensive attention and who expressed what the attention produced through the language of made and placed things rather than said things. She had begun paying attention to him in return, which was itself a change. Because she had spent 10 months in Caldwell Ridge paying the minimum necessary attention to the people around her in order to navigate the social requirements of the town without engaging more deeply than was required. She had been paying the minimum, and now she was paying more. And the more was specific to him in a way that she was aware of, and that she was not yet ready to examine directly, but that she was also not pretending was not happening. She noticed the quality of his work on the main street buildings, which she saw every day from the shop window and from the street, and which was the specific quality she had identified on the Tuesday, when she had said the joinery was exceptional and had meant it as observation rather than compliment. He did not cut corners. He did not do the visible work well and the hidden work adequately, which was the specific temptation of all craft work, and which most craftsmen succumbed to in some degree because the hidden work was not what the customer assessed. His hidden work was the same quality as his visible work, which she could see when he was doing the framing of the new building at the end of the street, and the framing was interior and would be covered, and no one would ever see it except the people who opened the walls for a repair in 20 years. And he was doing it with the same precision as the exterior joinery that everyone would see and judge him by. She noticed this and filed it in the interior place where she had been filing things about him, and where the filing had been accumulating into a specific understanding of the kind of man he was. He came to the shop on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of November with a question about a commission he had taken to build a wardrobe for one of the town's more prosperous families. A commission that required a fabric lining for the interior and that he had no experience sourcing. He had come to ask her about the fabric, which was a practical question with a practical answer, and she had given him the practical answer with the specific pleasure of someone who was being asked about something they knew well. And then they had talked for 20 minutes about the commission and about the particular requirements of fabric that was going to be in contact with wood over time, and about the specific challenges of building furniture that was also a textile object. And the conversation had the specific quality of two people talking about work they each understood deeply and finding in the mutual understanding a kind of ease that was different from the careful social exchanges she had been having with everyone else in Caldwell Ridge for 10 months. She had told him, at some point in the conversation, about a piece of furniture she had seen in Missouri as a child, a secretary desk that had belonged to a neighbor and that had been built with an interior lining of a specific silk that had retained its quality for 30 years. And she had described it with the animated quality that appeared in her voice when she talked about things she had found genuinely beautiful and that she did not monitor before it was already out. He had listened with the full quality of attention he gave to things she said, and had asked a question about the silk that told her he had understood the specific quality she was describing rather than the general category. She had answered and he had nodded, and he had said, "I would like to see that kind of thing." She had said, "I can show you some samples if you want to come back on Friday." He had said Friday morning. She had said Friday morning. He had come on Friday morning with the specific punctuality of someone for whom being where you said you would be, at the time you said you would be there, was not a social grace but a personal ethic. And she had shown him the samples she had pulled from her stock and from the order catalog she had from the Denver suppliers, and they had sat on either side of the work table with the samples spread between them, and talked about fabric with the focused attention of two people for whom the quality of materials was a professional concern and a personal value simultaneously. And the talking had been easy in the specific way that talking was easy when both people were genuinely interested in the same thing, and neither of them was performing the interest. The Friday mornings became a pattern, not planned as a pattern, not discussed as a pattern, simply arrived at through the natural accumulation of two people who had found that an hour of conversation on a Friday morning about whatever the current work had produced as a topic of interest was a good hour, and who kept finding, each Friday, that there was another topic that the previous conversation had generated, and that the next hour seemed like the right time to address it. They talked about wood and fabric and the specific challenges of making things that lasted, which was the professional register, and they talked about other things too, about the quality of the Wyoming light in different seasons, and about books, which was a topic that had arrived when she had mentioned a title and he had read it, which had surprised her, and about which he had thoughts that were not the thoughts of someone who had read it because it was available, but of someone who had read it because he was interested in the question it addressed. She told him small things about herself in the Friday mornings. Not the large things, not the full accounting of the history she had been carrying since Missouri, but the small things that were adjacent to the large things and that came out naturally in the course of conversation, when the conversation was going in an honest direction. She told him about her mother's sewing, about the specific quality of the work she had grown up watching and that had shaped her understanding of what good work meant. She told him about the books she had read as a child, about the specific pleasure of a reading chair by a window that she had had in her mother's house, and that she had not had since, which had come out naturally in the context of something else, and which had landed in the conversation between them with the specific quality of a piece of information that explained another piece of information that had already been given. He had heard it. Of course he had heard it. He heard everything she said with the comprehensive quality that was simply how he listened to her. And the specific information about the reading chair and the window had joined the other specific information he had been accumulating across the months and had clarified. She understood in retrospect the things she had not understood when she found the chair, that it was not just a chair, not just a practical object addressing a practical need, but the specific response of a man who had been listening carefully enough to know not just that she needed a chair, but what kind of chair she had needed and why. She sat in the chair every evening. This had become as automatic as breathing, as natural as the lamp at the window that she had always lit at the same hour, and the sitting in it had a quality she had not anticipated when she had first placed it by the window and lowered herself into it with the specific caution of someone receiving something they were not certain they deserved. It fit her exactly. It was the right height for her feet to rest flat. The back supported her in the precise place where her back needed supporting after a day of sewing work. The angle was the specific angle of the window at the hour she typically read, calculated somehow from the outside, from the street, from the specific observation of a man who had been watching the lamp at the window for 10 months and had understood from the watching the exact requirements of the person sitting in front of it. She thought about that on the evenings in the chair. She thought about what it meant to be observed with sufficient care to produce an object that fit that precisely. And the thinking about it produced in her a specific quality of feeling that she had not had in a long time, and that she was in the process of identifying not by the name she was not yet ready to give it, but by its characteristics, which were warmth and a specific disruption of the careful management she had been applying to her interior life since before she had come to Wyoming. A loosening in the specific way of things that have been held tightly for too long and are beginning, in the company of something that feels reliably safe, to ease. She said to him, on a Friday morning in the third week of November, that she had been thinking about the chair. He was at the work table with the fabric samples for the wardrobe commission spread before him, and he looked up at her with the green eyes that she had been learning across the November weeks, and that had the specific quality, she had decided, of someone who looked at things with the intention of understanding them rather than merely seeing them. He said, "What have you been thinking?" She said, "I have been thinking about how you knew." He said, "Knew what specifically?" She said, "The angle, the height, the specific dimensions of it." She said, "You built it from the outside, from the street." He said, "Yes," she said. "How long were you watching?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Since March." She said, "That is 8 months before the chair." He said, "I was not watching in order to build the chair." He said, "I was watching because you were there to watch." The distinction in the sentence was small and was everything. The specific difference between surveillance and attention, between the watching that collects and the watching that simply witnesses, and she held the distinction in the interior place for a long time after he said it. Longer than the Friday morning conversation lasted, longer than the week that followed, carrying it with the specific care of something that needed to be understood fully before it could be responded to. December in Caldwell Ridge was the month that clarified things. Not gently, not with the gradual revelation of a season that had time to be patient, but with the specific clarifying quality of a Wyoming winter at full depth, a cold that stripped away anything that was not genuinely present and left only what was actually there. The snow came in the first week and settled into permanence, and the town reorganized itself around the new conditions with the practiced efficiency of a community that had been through this before and knew what it required, the specific communal competence of people who understood that winter was not a disruption but a condition, and that the condition demanded adaptation rather than resistance. Clara adapted with the same focused practicality she brought to every changed condition, managing the shop and the rooms above it, through the adjustment of the season with the quiet competence that had become, across 10 months in Caldwell Ridge, the texture of her daily life. The work continued. The Friday mornings continued. The evenings in the chair by the window continued, and the December light through that window was the low, clear light of winter that came in at an angle she had not seen from that window before, and that transformed the familiar space into something slightly different, slightly more interior, slightly more itself. She had been thinking about what he had said on the November Friday, about the watching that was not in order to build the chair, but simply because she was there to watch. She had been thinking about it with the careful, patient attention she gave to things that required careful, patient thought, turning it over in the interior space where she did her best thinking, examining it from the various angles that the examination of such a statement required. She had lived with the statement for 2 weeks before she understood it completely, and what she understood when she understood it completely was this, that she had been seen, not incidentally and not instrumentally, but simply and completely, by someone who had decided to watch because she was worth watching and who had not required anything from the watching except the watching itself. She had not been seen that way before. She had been seen in the way that Edmund had seen her, which was with the particular appetite of someone who wanted what she appeared to be, and who had been satisfied by the appearance without reaching for the interior. She had been seen in the way that the county seat had seen her, which was with the particular efficiency of a community that needed a story and had constructed one from the available surface. She had not been seen in the way that Jasper Holt had been watching her from a building site on the main street of Caldwell Ridge for 8 months, before he put a cherrywood chair on her porch, which was without agenda and without requirement and without anything other than the simple, genuine interest of a man for whom she was worth the attention. The December Friday mornings had a different quality from the November ones, not different in their external form, which was the same. The work table and the samples and the professional conversation that moved into other conversation with the natural ease of two people who had established between them a specific territory of mutual interest and trust. Different in the interior quality of them, in the specific atmosphere that they had acquired across the accumulation of the weeks, an atmosphere that was warmer than November's had been, and that was produced by the specific change in both of them that the November conversations had worked, the slow loosening of the careful management each of them applied to themselves in the company of most people, and that was in the company of each other, no longer entirely operative. She told him things in December that she had not told anyone in Caldwell Ridge. Not the large things, not yet, but the things that were adjacent to the large things in a way that was moving gradually closer to the center of the territory she had been keeping sealed. She told him about the sewing work she had done in the county seat during the marriage, about the specific quality of the fine work she had done in those years that had been excellent, and that had been entirely for Edmund's household and Edmund's social purposes, and that had not, in the 3 years she had been doing it, produced a single piece that was entirely her own choice and her own vision. She said, "I have been making other people's things my whole adult life." He said, "Is that not what a seamstress does?" She said, "A seamstress makes what is commissioned." She said, "I mean that I have not made a single thing in my adult life purely because I wanted to make it." He looked at her. He said, "What would you make?" She said, "I do not know yet." She said, "I'm beginning to find out." He said, "Good." He said it with the specific quality of someone who understood the full weight of what she had just said and received it accordingly, and the receiving of it was itself the thing that made the saying of it worth having done. He told her things in December that he had not offered in the November conversations, the interior things that came out in a different register from the professional conversation, the register of someone who has decided that the person across the work table has earned a different level of access than the general public. He told her about the specific quality of his solitude, which was not lonely in the way she might have expected, but which had a specific weight that he had been carrying for a long time without entirely examining. He said, "I have been building things for other people for most of my adult life," she said. "Is that not what a carpenter does?" He looked at her and something in his expression shifted, recognizing the echo of the exchange they had just had, and he said, "Yes. And I have not, until recently, built a single thing purely because I wanted to build it for a specific person." The implication of the sentence was clear, and neither of them moved to make it explicit, because making it explicit was not what the moment required. The moment required the implication to simply sit between them in the December morning and be what it was. She began to tell him about Edmund in the 3rd week of December. Not planned, not constructed in advance as the appropriate next stage of disclosure, but arrived at naturally through the course of a conversation that had moved in that direction through its own logic, and that had reached a point where the next honest thing to say was something about the history she had been carrying. She told it without drama, without the particular performance of difficulty that some people brought to difficult disclosures in the plain honest register that had become her register with him. She told him about the erosion, about the specific quality of a marriage in which she had been reduced gradually and without violence. A reduction so gradual that she had not seen it clearly while it was happening and had only understood its full extent in the months following Edmund's death, when she had looked at herself and found that the dimensions were considerably smaller than they had been at the beginning. She said, "I had opinions, and then I had fewer, and then I had the opinions that were permitted." She said, "I had friendships, and then I had fewer, and then I had the social occasions that were appropriate." She said, "I had myself, and then I had less of myself, and then I had the version of myself that was required." She said it plainly, and he listened with the complete quality. And when she had finished, he was quiet for a long time, in the way he was quiet when he was processing something that required full consideration before response. Then he said, "How much of yourself did you bring to Caldwell Ridge?" She said, "I am not certain." She said, "I am in the process of finding out." He said, "I can tell you what I see." She said, "Tell me." He said, "More than you know you brought." The darkest moment arrived. As the darkest moments tended to arrive in small towns, through the specific channel of a community that pays attention to its members without always understanding what it is looking at. It arrived in the form of Mrs. Halbert, the wife of the town's most prominent merchant, a woman of considerable social authority and genuine warmth who had taken an interest in Clara's welfare since her arrival in a way that was entirely well-intentioned and that was operating on this particular December morning from a framework that was the framework of its time and place and that had not accounted for the specific situation it was attempting to address. Mrs. Halbert arrived at the shop on a Wednesday morning with a gift of preserved peaches and an expression that Clara had learned to recognize in the years since Edmund's death, the expression of a woman who has decided that kindness requires her to say something difficult. She sat at the chair Clara offered, which was the good chair reserved for customers, and she accepted the tea that was offered, and then she said with a specific combination of warmth and concern that made what followed more difficult rather than easier, "My dear, I hope you will not take this badly because it is said entirely out of care for you." She said, "People in town have begun to notice that Jasper Holt visits your shop with some regularity and stays for some time, and while I'm certain the visits are entirely proper, you will understand that a woman in your position," she used the phrase "a woman in your position" in the specific way of someone who meant a widow without established social capital in a community that had not yet fully decided about her, "needs to be especially careful about the impressions she makes. She said, "I would hate for anything to complicate your standing here, which you have been building so carefully." Clara received it with a composed grace that had been her reliable management of difficult social moments for years, and she thanked Mrs. Halbert for her concern and her care, and she saw her to the door with the specific warmth that was appropriate to the visit, and she closed the door and stood in the shop with the gift of preserved peaches on the work table and the specific cold clarity of someone who has just been reminded, in the language of kindness, that the world has assigned her a position and has expectations about how someone in that position should conduct themselves. She sat at the sewing table. She did not sew. She looked at the window where the December light came in at its low winter angle, and she thought about what Mrs. Halbert had said, and she thought about the Friday mornings and the small things on the porch and the cherry wood chair and the way he had said, "I was watching because you were there to watch," and the way he had said, "More than you know you brought." And she thought about all of it with the clear, cold thinking of someone who has had enough experience of difficult situations to think through them rather than react to them. And what she arrived at was not the distress she might have expected, but a specific and clarifying anger that was not directed at Mrs. Halbert, who had meant well and who was a product of the same framework that had produced every difficult thing in Clara's adult life, but at the framework itself, at the specific architecture of a world that looked at a woman finding her dimensions again after years of reduction and called it something requiring management. She thought about leaving. She had left before and she knew how to leave, and the leaving had, in the past, been the available solution to the specific problem of being somewhere that had decided who you were. She sat with the thought of leaving for some time. She sat with the specific weight of it, the familiar weight of it, the weight of something she had carried often enough to know its dimensions. And then she thought about the chair. She thought about the specific thing it had taken to build that chair. The 8 months of attention and the cherry wood saved for something worth the grain and the measuring from the street and the cushion in the fabric ordered from Denver because nothing in Caldwell Ridge was right. She thought about what it meant to be the recipient of that kind of attention and what it would mean to leave it behind. And she thought about the Friday mornings and the specific quality of the conversations that happened in them. And she understood sitting at the sewing table in the December light with the gift of preserved peaches on the work table, that what she was sitting in the middle of was the specific thing she had come to Caldwell Ridge to find without knowing she was looking for it, which was the condition of being genuinely known by someone who had sought the knowing without agenda and who had expressed it in the specific language of a man who built things that lasted. She was not going to leave. But she needed to tell him what had happened. Because what had happened was about both of them, and the only honest response to something that was about both of them was to address it with both of them present. And the managed response, the response that protected her from the discomfort of the conversation by simply not having it, was the response of the woman she had been for too long and was not willing to continue being. She went to find him. Not that evening. Not after the December dark had made the main street quiet and the going would have been the kind of going that confirmed Mrs. Halbert's concerns rather than addressed them. She went the following morning, in the proper light of a December Thursday when the main street was occupied with the ordinary business of the day, and when going to speak to the carpenter who worked at the end of the street was the ordinary action of a woman who had ordinary business with a craftsman and was conducting it in the ordinary way. He was at the building site when she arrived, working on the interior finishing of the new structure with the focused competence of someone deep in the detail of precise work. And he looked up when she appeared with the specific quality of attention he gave to her appearances, which was complete and immediate, and not the general social attentiveness of someone registering a visitor, but the particular attentiveness of someone for whom this specific visitor required and deserved full attention. She said, "I need to talk to you about something." He set down the tool he was holding. He said, "All right." And she told him, standing in the December morning light with the Wyoming cold around them and the unfinished building behind him, exactly what Mrs. Halbert had said and exactly how she had received it and exactly what she had thought about afterward, without the social softening that would have made the telling easier and the meaning less clear, because the social softening was not the register she intended to use with him anymore. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting and without the particular expressions that people sometimes produced when receiving difficult information. The expressions that communicated their own discomfort with the content rather than genuine attention to the person delivering it. He listened with a complete quality that was simply how he listened to her. Standing in the cold December morning with the unfinished building behind him and the main street of Caldwell Ridge proceeding with its ordinary business around them, and when she had finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was giving a thing its full consideration before responding. Then he said, "What did you decide?" Not "what did she say?" Not what are you going to do about it? Not the particular form of response that would have put the weight of the situation on her and positioned him as a passive element within it. What did you decide? The question that assumed she had already done the primary work of the situation and was reporting the result rather than asking for guidance. The question of someone who knew her well enough to know that she had sat with this through the night and had arrived at a position and that the position was what mattered now. She said, I decided I'm not leaving. He looked at her. He said, good. She said, I also decided that I'm not going to manage this in the way I have managed things in the past, which is to reduce myself until the concern is no longer applicable. He said, I know. She said, I am telling you that I know, which is different from knowing it without being able to say it. He said, yes, it is different. She said, Mrs. Halbert's concern is not malicious. It is a product of a framework that I have been living inside my entire adult life, and that I am tired of living inside. He said, tell me what you want instead. She looked at him. She said, I want the Friday mornings. He said, you have them. She said, I want them without the specific weight of a community that has decided what they are and what they say about me. He said, the community will decide what it decides. He said, what it decides is not what the thing actually is. She said, I know that. She said, I'm telling you that the knowing of it is not always sufficient protection against the weight of it. He said, I know. He said it with the specific quality of someone who had also been inside the experience he was acknowledging, who was not speaking theoretically, but from the interior of having understood something from the inside. He said, I have been the man that people describe as big and quiet and useful and have not particularly inquired further for 4 years. He said, I know the specific weight of being known only by your outline. She looked at him with the hazel eyes in the December morning light. And something in her expression shifted in the specific way it shifted when something he said found the exact place it was aimed at, the place below the careful management where the actual interior of her lived. She said, then you understand why the Friday mornings are not a small thing to me. He said, they are not a small thing to me either. The words sat between them in the cold morning air with the specific weight of something that had been moving toward being said for a long time and had finally, in the specific conditions of the December morning, found the right moment. She held them for a moment, not long, just the specific moment required to receive something true that had been offered plainly and without embellishment. Then she said, I have been thinking about what you said, about watching because I was there to watch. He said, yes. She said, I have been thinking about what that means for a man who does not say things unless he means them precisely. He said, what have you concluded? She said, I have concluded that it means something specific. He said, it does. She said, tell me what it means specifically. And he did something then that she had not expected, which was to stop and look at her for a long moment with the green eyes in the December light, and then say, in the same plain quiet register he used for everything that was true, it means that I have been in love with you since approximately April. He said, I did not know it precisely in April. He said, by June I was certain. He said, I built the chair in September because there was a thing I could do, and I did it, and the rest I have been waiting to know how to say. She was very still. The December morning continued around them, with the complete indifference of the external world, to the specific interior events of two people standing in it, and the cold pressed its Wyoming quality against everything. And somewhere down the main street a door opened and closed, and a horse moved on the frozen ground, and all of it was entirely peripheral to the specific territory of the moment between them, which was the territory of a thing being said plainly and received plainly between two people, for whom plain was the only register that mattered. She looked at him. She said, how did you know I was not ready in June? He said, the same way I knew the angle of the chair and the height of the windowsill and the specific weight of a slim woman sitting in a particular position for hours at a time. He said, I paid attention. She said to me, he said, to you? He said it simply and with the complete absence of apology or qualification, as the plain fact of something that had been true since April, and that he was now stating in the direct daylight of a December morning because she had come to find him and had told him she was not leaving, and had asked him to tell her what the watching meant, and he had told her. She said, I need to tell you something in return. He waited. She said, I have been in Caldwell Ridge for 10 months, and I have spent those 10 months making myself as small as possible because small felt safe, and because Caldwell Ridge had not given me a reason to be larger. She said, you gave me a reason. She said, not the chair, although the chair was the beginning of my understanding. She said, the Friday mornings, the way you listen, the specific quality of your attention, which is not the attention that wants something from what it attends to, but the attention that is simply present with it. She said, I have not been attended to in that way before. She said, I did not know what it felt like until you showed me what it felt like, which is the specific cruelty of having been without something for so long that you have lost the memory of what it is. He was looking at her with the complete quality of his attention, the full weight of it, the green eyes that saw everything she had been trying to be invisible to for 10 months, and that had seen her anyway. And she was looking back at him with the hazel eyes that had been careful and were less careful now, that had been watchful and were less watchful now, that were in the specific process of becoming what they had been before she had learned to make them careful and watchful, which was simply open. She said, "I think I have been falling in love with you since the October morning when I confirmed you had built the chair." He said, "That is 2 months after I built it." She said, "I needed the 2 months." He said, "I know." She said, "You are not bothered by the 2 months." He said, "I waited from June to October." He said, 2 months is nothing. Something in her chest that had been held carefully for a very long time released by a fraction. Not all at once, not with the dramatic suddenness of things that break, but with the specific gradual ease of something that has been held at tension for longer than was necessary and is being slowly, carefully, deliberately let go. He stepped toward her, one step unhurried across the cold ground of the December morning, bringing him within the specific proximity that was different from the working proximity and the conversational proximity and all the other measured proximities of the past months. The proximity of someone who has said what he means and is now present with what the saying has produced. He was so much larger than her that the scale of it was simply the fact of him being near, and he reached out and took her hands in both of his, the way he had reached for things that required the full capacity of his hands, which was carefully, with the specific deliberateness of someone for whom careful handling was not a performance of gentleness but simply how you handled things that mattered. Her hands were cold from the December morning and his were warm in the specific way of someone who had been working and whose hands carried the warmth of the work in them, and he held her hands and looked at her and said nothing because nothing was required and everything necessary had already been said. She looked at her hands in his. She said, "You have very large hands," he said. "I know," she said, "they are the hands that built the chair." He said, "Yes." She said, "Everything you make is made with those hands." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have been looking at your hands for 2 months." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "You looked at them when you thought I was not watching you look." She said, "You were always watching." He said, "I told you." She said, "You told me you were watching because I was there to watch." He said, "That is still true." She said, "It is still disorienting." He said, "I know." He said, "Does it need to stop being disorienting before you can do something with it?" She looked at him. She said, "No." She said, "I think the disorientation is part of what it is." He said, "Yes, I think so too." She said, "Mrs. Halbert will continue to have concerns." He said, "Probably." She said, "The town will continue to form opinions." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not going to manage myself around their opinions." He said, "I know." She said, "I need you to know that I know, not just in theory, but in the specific practical reality of a woman who has been managing herself around other people's opinions for most of her adult life and is choosing not to do that anymore." He said, "I hear the difference." He said it with the specific quality of someone who had been listening to her long enough to know what the difference sounded like and who was registering it accurately. He said, "I'm going to tell you something that may be useful." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been in Caldwell Ridge for 4 years, and my standing in this town is the specific standing of a man who built half of it and who has a reputation for work that lasts and for conduct that is reliable." He said, "That standing is not nothing." He said, "And I intend to use it." She said, "Use it how?" He said, "By making it clear in the way that I make things clear, which is through action rather than explanation, that my Friday mornings are not something the town has any standing to have opinions about." She said, "How will you do that?" He said, "The same way I do everything." He said, "Consistently and over time." She said, "That is not a fast solution." He said, "No." He said, "But it is the kind that lasts." She looked at him and felt the specific quality of something settling in her that had not been settled in a very long time. The settling of someone who has been in uncertain ground for so many years that the memory of solid ground had become theoretical and is now standing on something that is genuinely solid and discovering that the theory was accurate. She said, "I would like to go back to the shop now," he said. "All right," she said, "and I would like you to come to the shop on Friday morning as usual." He said, "I will be there." She said, "And I will not be managing myself around anyone's opinion of that." He said, "Good." She said, "It is genuinely good, not good as in acceptable or good as in manageable, good." He said, "I know the difference." She said, "I know you do." She stepped back. She was still holding one of his hands, and she released it with the specific deliberateness of someone who is choosing to release something rather than having it taken from them, which was its own small statement of a new kind of agency that she was beginning to understand was available to her. She said, "Friday morning." He said, "Friday morning." She walked back down the main street of Caldwell Ridge toward the shop in the December light, with the specific quality of someone who has just set down a weight they have been carrying so long, they had stopped noticing it as weight. And the December morning was cold and clear and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in its vicinity. And the mountains were white above the valley, and the shop was warm when she went inside. and the cherry wood chair was by the window where it had always been, and she sat in it for a moment before the day's work began, and felt the specific shape of a life that was beginning, slowly and without announcement, to have the dimensions that it had always been supposed to have. January in Caldwell Ridge was the month that confirmed things. Not dramatically, not with the particular announcement of a season that needed to make its nature known, but with the quiet confirmation of something that has been true for long enough to have become simply the condition of daily life rather than a discovery still in the process of being made. The snow was deep and permanent, and the cold was the serious cold of the high Wyoming winter that required respect and produced, in those who gave it the respect it required, a specific quality of interior warmth that was different from the warmth of easier seasons because it was warmth that had been earned against the cold rather than simply available. Clara found she was warm, not in the provisional way of someone who has recently come in from the cold and is waiting to find out whether the warmth will hold, but in the specific settled way of someone for whom the warmth has become the baseline and the baseline has become reliable enough to stop monitoring. The Friday mornings continued. They continued with the specific consistency that had characterized them since they became a pattern, and they continued in December, the consistency carrying through the new year without interruption and without any particular ceremony marking the continuation, because the continuation did not require ceremony. It was simply what happened on Friday mornings, which was that Jasper Holt came to the seamstress shop at 9 o'clock and sat across the work table from Clara Ashwood, and they talked for an hour about whatever the previous week had produced, as a subject of genuine interest between two people who had been finding, week by week, that the subjects available between them were not exhausting but expanding, that each conversation generated the material for the next one with the specific fertility of exchanges between people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds. The town adjusted its opinions, not quickly, not with the particular speed of a community that had decided it had been wrong and was eager to demonstrate the correction, but with the gradual recalibration of a community that had been given sufficient, consistent evidence over sufficient time to revise its working conclusions, which was how Caldwell Ridge operated on most things, which was also how Jasper had said it would operate, and which had been one of the things she had needed to trust him on before the trust had been confirmed by the evidence. He had been right. The visits to the shop on Friday mornings, conducted in the plain daylight of the main street, with the consistency of something that was simply what it was, rather than something that needed to defend itself, had accumulated across the December and January weeks into a fact of the town's landscape rather than a subject of its speculation, and the speculation had moved, as speculation did when the subject of it proved uninteresting to other subjects. Mrs. Halbert had come back in January with another gift of preserved peaches, which was her specific way of communicating that the previous conversation had been superseded and that the current state of things was acceptable to her. And Clara had accepted the peaches with the grace that was genuine rather than performed, and had offered tea, and they had talked about the winter and the upcoming social occasion and the specific quality of the new fabric that had arrived from the Denver supplier, and it had been a perfectly ordinary neighborly visit, and that was exactly what it was. She had been making things for herself. This was the change that she noticed most clearly across the January weeks. The change that she understood as the most significant indicator of the interior shift that the autumn and winter had worked in her. She had begun making things that were purely her own choice and her own vision. Not commissioned work, not work done for the household or the social purposes of another person, but things she made because she wanted to make them, because the material suggested them and her hands understood how to produce them, and the making of them produced in her the specific pleasure of someone doing the work they were made to do without any requirement attached to the doing beyond the work itself. She had made a piece in January that she had been thinking about since a conversation with Jasper in early December about the secretary desk she had seen in Missouri as a child and the 30-year-old silk that had lined its interior. She had sourced a silk from the Denver supplier, the specific quality she had been describing, and she had made a small interior case from it. A case for keeping the things that were most worth keeping, lined with the silk and closed with a button she had carved from a piece of the cherry wood he had given her. A small piece left over from the chair's making that she had found on the step one morning, with no note, which was exactly the way she would have expected him to give it. She had shown him the case on a Friday morning in the second week of January, and he had taken it in his large hands and examined it with the focused attention of a craftsman looking at another craftsman's work. And he had said, "The silk is exactly what you described." She had said, "Yes," he had said, "and the button." She had said, "The cherry wood you left me." He had looked at her with the green eyes and said nothing for a moment. And then he had said, "It is very good work," she had said. I know she had said it without the self-effacement she had previously applied to compliments on her work. without the reduction of yes, but, or it is only, or any of the qualifications that had been the habitual packaging of her competence for years. She had said, I know, with the plain acceptance of someone receiving an accurate assessment of a thing she had made, because she had made it well and she knew she had made it well. And the knowing of it was no longer something that needed to be hidden. He had asked her to marry him on a Friday morning in the last week of January, not constructed as a proposal, not staged or arranged for maximum effect, but arrived at naturally through the conversation of the morning, the way most significant things between them arrived, through the honest accumulation of two people talking in the direction of what was true. They had been talking about the spring, about the specific quality of Wyoming spring that was not the soft arrival of spring in more forgiving climates, but the specific hard-earned spring of a landscape that made you wait through a serious winter before giving you the warmth. And she had said something about what she thought she might plant in the small yard behind the shop in the spring if the yard could be made suitable for planting, and he had said he could make the yard suitable for planting if she wanted, and she had said, that assumes I will be here in the spring. He had said, you said in December you were not leaving? She had said, I said I was not leaving then. He had said, tell me if that has changed. She had said, it has not changed. He had said, then tell me what you want. She had said, I want what I have. I want the Friday mornings and the work and the chair by the window. He had said, and... She had looked at him. He had said, tell me what else you want. She had said, I want you to be the person I have the Friday mornings with for the foreseeable future. He had said, define foreseeable. She had said, all of it. He had been quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of someone receiving something they had hoped for and are taking in fully before responding. Then he said, marry me. He said it in the same register. He said everything that mattered plainly and directly and without embellishment. The specific form of the most important available ask expressed in its simplest possible language. She said yes. She said it before the end of the sentence. Before the word had fully resolved in the air between them, with the specific immediacy of someone for whom the answer had been forming since before the question was asked. He said, good. She said, that is your response. He said, yes. She said, it is a very simple response to a significant question. He said, it is an accurate response. She said, yes. She said, it is. And she laughed genuinely fully, with the specific quality of a laugh that was entirely her own and that had been returning to her across the autumn and winter weeks like a thing she had mislaid a long time ago and was finding again in the specific places it had always been, waiting for her to look in the right direction. He reached across the work table and took her hand. His hand was so much larger than hers that the enclosing of it was complete, and his hand was warm the way it was always warm, the warmth of someone whose hands were always engaged in the work of making things. And she felt the warmth and felt the specific permanence of it, the specific quality of something that had been built to last and that was lasting. That would continue to last because it had been made correctly from the beginning by someone who held their work to a standard that was internal rather than external, and who would hold this the same way. There is a lesson in Clara's story that belongs to everyone who has ever been reduced by circumstances or by people, or by the accumulated weight of a world that had a role for them and was not particularly interested in the person filling it. Everyone who has made themselves smaller than they were because smaller felt safer, and because the alternative had not yet been shown to be worth the risk of being larger. Everyone who has arrived somewhere new with a modest trunk and a determination to survive and has discovered, in the ordinary course of an ordinary life in an ordinary town, that surviving was not the whole of what was available. The lesson is this: some people love by making things. Not by saying the right words or by producing the grand gesture or by the particular performance of affection that announces itself clearly and asks you to acknowledge it. By paying attention to what you actually need, not what you say you need, not what you would accept, but what you actually need, the specific dimensions of the thing that would fit you and only you, and then making it with their hands, quietly, without announcement, placing it where you will find it when you're ready to find it, and trusting that you will understand it when you do. That kind of love does not require you to be grateful in a particular way, or to receive it in a particular way, or to perform your receiving for the benefit of the giver. It only requires you to sit in the chair. To let the thing that was made for you be what it is, which is evidence that you have been seen, specifically and completely and without any agenda beyond the seeing, by someone who found you worth the cherry wood that had been saved since winter for something worthy of the grain. You are worthy of the grain. You have always been worthy of the grain. The question was never whether you were worth a thing made carefully and precisely to your specific dimensions. The question was only whether you would be in the right place at the right time for the person who had been watching from across the street to understand what you needed and to build it. You were, they did. And the chair that appeared on the porch on an October morning was not the beginning of the story and is not the end of it. It is the visible evidence of the part of the story that happened before anyone spoke. The months of attention and the saved wood and the measured window and the specific quality of a love that expresses itself in the language of made things because it is too complete and too particular to be contained in any other language. It is the proof left on the porch without a note that you were seen, that you were known, that someone found you worth the best material they had been saving and the most careful work they could do, and the specific patience of a man who understood that the right thing, built correctly and placed quietly, would speak for itself when you were ready to hear it. You were ready, you found it, you carried it inside and sat in it by the window, and it fit perfectly. Because it was made for you, because you were worth making it for, because you have always been worth making it for. Remember that. It will continue to be true.